با سلام خدمت بینندگان عزیز. امروز در خدمت جناب پروفسور پول اسمیت از دانشگاه ناتینگهام هستیم. ایشون کارشناس مسائل فرانسه هستن و امروز در رابطه با موضوع اخیر در مدارس فرانسه و ممنوعیت عبایه و فشارهایی که بر روی مسلمانان فرانسوی از سوی دولت ماکرون داره اعمال میشه صحبت کنیم. Professor Smith, thank you so much for having us. Let's start with recent decision of French government. Since the inauguration of Emmanuel Macron's government in France, we have seen pressure on the French Muslims and in various ways. And in the last case, we see the banning of the abaya in French schools. What is the reason and the root of this restriction for French Muslims?
Okay, well, I think there are lots of factors to take into account. And I think above all, the most disappointing, I suppose, from my perspective, is that it's kind of being used as a pretext to cover all kinds of other problems in the French education system. There's also a political dimension to this. Macron and his government, particularly some of his ministers, his new education minister, and that's an important factor. Gabriel Attal, the new education minister, wanted to make a statement. And what Macron and Attal are trying to do is to steal political ground from the French right. And the French right at the moment is being squeezed between Macron on one side and the far right of Marine Le Pen and Eric Zemmour on the other. And the way that they themselves are trying to express themselves is to play the secular game, the idea of the secular state, and be very critical of, for example, French Muslim girls turning up to school in a particular form of dress, as you mentioned just now. And so what Attal is trying to do is kind of present himself as a fairly strict figure, reclaiming the idea of the secular republic. The problem is that young French Muslim girls in particular find themselves in the middle of that political argument.
So you mean the secularization of in France is not done with Muslims, right?
Well, it's not specifically aimed at Muslims. Nobody is supposed to go to school wearing something which expresses their religion in the French system. But of course, what it means in modern France is particularly that, and banning of, previously it was the headscarves in French schools, banning of particular forms of dress, those things, or at least being very strict about it, is something that's new this time. And of course, it's picking on French Muslims, particularly those young Muslim girls who want to go to school dressed in a particular way. But it's making a lot of noise from the government's point of view, which actually is masking a lot of other problems in the education system. What's very important to understand about education in France, which is very different to, say, for example, the British education system, is that the state and education are very closely linked to one another. And so what happens within education, it's always seen as being the minister should do something. And what I don't really understand, as an outside observer, is why this has been a situation that already exists. And previously, individual head teachers could deal with the situation. If they decided, to just let things go, they didn't have to actually intervene. They could just allow girls to turn up dressed in however they wanted. They can't wear the headscarf, but they could wear other expressions of their religious belief, their cultural background, and that was left to schools to decide. And then the minister decides, because of the political situation and because actually there are lots of other problems in French education, to kind of take a firm approach. And this is all about the politicization of it. And it's very clear that, who the victims are. Now, we also know, I don't know if you've seen the statistics for this, but of the millions of children who go to school every day, actually fewer than 300 girls chose to turn up dressed in this particular way, and of those 300, only 50 refused to go home again and change their dress. So it's an impingement, absolutely. It's an infringement of freedom to wear whatever you want, but that's not allowed in the French system.
Sorry for interrupting your words. It looks like the French government made attention by itself in society.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, nobody could argue with that. It's the government, a particular minister, Gabriel Attal, the Minister of Education, who decided not just to allow. Technically speaking, it wasn't allowed anyway. Okay, but there's always a gap between the law and what actually happens, and it was previously left to individual institutions to decide how they handled the situation. Then this new Minister of Education, decides to kind of make his mark, as it were, by saying, we're going to come down hard on this. We're not having any of this clothing being worn by Muslim girls at school. And what that, of course, is doing is obviously playing to a right-wing electorate, but it's very important to understand in the French context, it also challenges the left, because the left in France, is very conscious of its own secular roots. The idea of the secular state in France actually originally comes from the left. I mean, if you had said to me 10, possibly 15 years ago, that it would be the French right that is defending the secular state in education, I would have said, good Lord, that seems almost impossible, because it was always the left. Because, of course, back in the day, 15, 20 years ago, when we talked about the secular schools, we were talking about the resistance to resurgent Catholicism. Now that's changed. And so what Macron was doing and what his minister was doing was not only trying to seize, if you like, take away the initiative from the French right and the French far right, but also challenging the left to say, and where do you stand on this? And a lot of supporters of the left, some people on the left, even some on the right, said this is a ridiculous argument to have. Please don't think. I wouldn't want you to think that everybody in France agrees with the education minister. But some people on the left say, this is a ridiculous argument to have. But others are saying, actually, we believe in secularism and we support this. So it's quite a mixed response.
Professor, let's look at the history. Some believe that the French government's view of religious and racial minorities is still modeled after the colonial era of this country in Africa. I mean, the colonization. Considers France's colonial past. How correct is this analysis in your opinion?
Well, I think there's a lot to be said for it. I think one of the problems that France has, I mean, all Western countries have it. Britain is no better, for example. But there's a very specific French way of thinking about the colonial past, which is that the French use an expression, the mission civilisatrice, that it was a civilizing mission. Now, the English use that expression as well, the British use that expression as well, but in France, it's the way that the whole thing is framed, that the French presence in Africa, in North Africa, wherever France was present in the world.
I mean, the modern missions for savages, right? Looking from
absolutely that these people are yes, it goes back to the Enlightenment, the 18th century. I'm not going all that way back, but the idea that we, the French, we know about civilization. Our values of liberty, equality, and fraternity are universal values, and we must bring those things to you use the term, I'll put it in quotation marks, but let's use it, that idea of the uneducated, the uncivilized, the savage. And so that was a good thing. Okay, that there were bad moments in colonization, but that generally speaking, overall, that experience was a good experience. That would be the French perspective. And of course, it's often the French will also contrast that with the British experience. They'll say that there was a bad colonialism, British colonialism, and you will know all about that in terms of British presence in in Iran, in the Middle East, and the British colonialism was bad, and French colonialism was good. And there was this kind of a myth was built around that in France, that it was good, but also the process of decolonisation was carried out in a largely peaceful means, and that France remains present in Africa for positive reasons. Now, we know that that is very problematic. We've seen that being challenged very recently in Niger. We've seen it being challenged in Mali. We've seen it being challenged in lots of different places.
And also in Atlas Islands, the forever lands of France. In in Guyana.
Yeah, absolutely. Or in most recently in Mayotte, for example. I was listening to a program only yesterday on the French radio about the way that the island of Mayotte in the Indian Ocean is being mismanaged by it's actually directly ruled from Paris. So yes, you're right. There are also these essentially they're still colonies really who are kind of they're around the world, but being the sense is this was to do with in Mayotte. There's a really big problem of the management of water and pollution of the water, and these things, and of course this leads to a sense that we've been forgotten by Paris. Paris likes to pretend that it is this fabulous capital, that France is this benevolent power, but the reality for us in Mayotte is very different, and so these things are being challenged in lots of different ways.
Professor Smith, these restrictions against the French Muslims start with the hijab, burqa, burkini, and now the abaya has been banned. How far will these bans go, and what's the future awaits for French Muslims with this banning? Maybe the next step are closing all mosques. Some people say that.
Well, I think that's. I think that we need to handle those kind of things with care. I mean, one can understand a very angry reaction amongst French Muslims, but there are 6 million. We think there are 6 million Muslims in France. We don't know the exact numbers because these things are not. This information is not gathered. It's not officially permitted to actually. When the French have their population census, you don't declare your religion. That's seen as being, the French see that as being the part of the sense of, they call it colour blindness, that the state does not, religion is your business, and your religion is for the home. We don't quantify that. But there are 6 million Muslims in France, most of whom, the overwhelming majority of whom, go about their daily lives perfectly peacefully, perfectly well integrated into French society amongst their communities or wherever they live. But one can understand a lot of anxiety that this kind of focusing on French Muslims causes. And you mentioned mosques there, and indeed there's a case, for example, you might know about this in the city of Fréjus, where a mosque was built recently. There's an argument going on in the courts about whether it actually complied with the building regulations. So the far right, there's now a far right mayor in this town of Fréjus. He wants to close it down, but it was actually authorised and built not under a left-wing mayor, but under a right-wing mayor. So I want to draw a distinction between, let's say, the right and the far right. And so the argument is going on between, within, if you like, the right wing of the French. And the French courts have actually said, we're not going to close this mosque down. The building regulations may have been slightly, moved around. It might not have been completely above board, but we are not going to close the mosque. And so but the problem is that there are people in all kinds of, from all kinds of different positions who want to use that situation to antagonise, to cause antagonism between French Muslims and French non-Muslims. Similarly, whenever there's any kind of attack on, let's say, a French church, the immediate knee-jerk reaction of social media is, oh, was it a Muslim? Well, 99 times out of 100, it isn't. Anti-Semitic attacks, 99 times out of 100, they are not committed in France, they're not committed by Muslims. But there is always this kind of sense that there are elements in French society who want to play up to that.
Let me say that it's like they try for find someone who blame it for everything, and the Muslims are the victims, right?
I think that has become, in some situations there is the case, and particularly, and what's happening and what has been really quite distressing for observers of French society in recent times is the growth of the far right, is the growth also of the control of certain media in France, of people who are on the far right of the spectrum, the political spectrum. There's a right-wing industrialist who's taken over a newspaper called the Journal du Dimanche, who's put in place an editor who is very clearly on the far right, and this is kind of building a kind of head of steam behind scapegoating French Muslims. And of course, it's true that you do have, in the last presidential election, for example, you had Eric Zemmour, who was a far right-wing candidate, who was basically saying that Islam and the French Republic are not compatible. And of course, what he means by that is that Muslims cannot be good French citizens. Now, he is a small minority, but there are other people who want to kind of use that discourse to kind of build up, particularly ahead of the 2027 election, build up political support. And that's where the danger lies. And you're right that the problem with, and I wouldn't disagree with you at all, that when the French government and the minister, Gabriel Attal, talks about banning certain forms of clothing, that of course just enables, and this is what we've seen in French society, in America, in Britain as well, the enabling, that's the word that we use in English for that, the kind of, by trying to counter the far right by actually using some of its ideas, you give that space.
You mean the religious signs, banning of the religious signs, just because of Muslims and just for Muslims, not for Jewish or Christians, right?
Oh, no, they're not allowed to. You're not supposed to, at school, wear any ostentatious outward sign of religion. You can wear a small, for example, Christians can wear a small, or Jews can wear a small necklace with a cross, with the Star of David, or a cross, or a necklace with a small symbol of your religious belief. You can do that, but it's the you're not supposed to wear clothing which expresses your religious and cultural beliefs.
Excuse me, Professor Smith. Some believe that this pressure will eventually cause of a migration of the French professionals from France and will ultimately harm the French economy and society. How true is this opinion?
I think there's something in it. I think what it is doing is it's certainly not encouraging. Let's think of a particular ethnic and perhaps religious group within French society, or perhaps second or third generation French or Algerian origin. And it's certainly true that a lot of the highly educated second, third generation young people whose parents migrated to France, let's say in the 50s and 60s, so they might even be fourth generation, are beginning to, we're certainly seeing them moving, particularly if they work in things like information technology, beginning to move elsewhere. And beginning to move to the number of people of French origin in Silicon Valley, for example, has exploded in recent years. So there is a risk of some kind of brain drain, of a migration of intelligence, of ability, of skills away from France. That's true. But I think the numbers they're not huge numbers. It is happening, but they're not huge numbers. And I think there's also, one would hope, that actually the people who are well established in France would stay. So I'm not sure that there's a massive movement away, but we have seen in recent years, of course, as you will know, particularly in Algeria, in Morocco. Morocco is a particularly very interesting case at the moment. Mm-hmm. A drift away from the Francophone past.
For a last question, what do you think is the role of Muslim academics and the scholars in the face of the risk of exterminism and extremism in the Islamic world and the abuse of this issue by the French government?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
What do you think is the role of Muslim academics and scholars in the face of the risk of extremism in the Islamic world and the abuse of these issues by the French government?
Yeah, got you. I think that the Muslim scholars within France are finding it very difficult to find a voice. And I think that the problem is that very often the French government, Nicolas Sarkozy launched a process of trying to find establishing a council, which is now it's been transformed into something else, trying to find a way of opening up a dialogue and creating a kind of the notion of a French Muslim identity or a Muslim French identity, whichever way you want to think about that. But it always somehow gets pushed to the side. There's this, it's very difficult in France to talk about any notion of a sub-national community, whether that's ethnic or whether it's religious. It always runs into this problem of not just secularism, but there's another important phrase in the French constitution that France is one and indivisible. So, and what that does in real terms is to actually make it very difficult to talk about a French, let me give you an example, a French and Corsican identity, or a French and Algerian identity, those two things mixed together. You know, you've got hundreds of years of a relationship, a difficult relationship perhaps, but a relationship between France and Algeria. And so talking about those things in an intelligent way, you kind of begin a dialogue, and then there's always someone who will say the secular state, and the whole thing kind of falls apart. So it's very difficult for a reasonable, measured, intelligent conversation to take place. And that's where, particularly in the French context, Muslim scholars often struggle within the French context to find the space where they can express themselves, both in France and then to talk, to have a dialogue outside, and that's actually very complicated.
Professor Smith, thank you so much for having us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.